friends. Welcome to C Club's podcast. My name is Jess. Today I'm joined by Alex Zhang, the mayor of FWB, also known as, well, at least referred to himself as the aspiring Jane Jacobs of DAOs. We jumped into a bit of a winding conversation. We talked about season 5, the upcoming season for FWB. We talked a lot about new tools that they're building, what they're calling social spaces. We dive into reputation with this new FWB ID badge they're rolling out, NFTs with evolving metadata that track your participation, reputation, and contribution in the broader FWB ecosystem, and some of the knock-on effects and incentives that might come from that. Changed my mind on a few things, actually, so I found that one very interesting. We talked a lot about scaling contributions and contributors and how he's thinking about that. And of course, I asked him about the somewhat recent Treasury diversification round that they conducted and any lessons that they may have learned from that. Alex thinks extremely deeply and thoughtfully about growing DAOs, cares deeply about the success of FWB and the environment that gets created there. And I think that comes through in our conversation. So let's jump into it. Alex, welcome to Club. How are you doing, my friend?
I am doing great. How are you?
I'm great. So, so much to get into. I think, when you think about the history of social DAOs, community tokens, friends with benefits is like the name that keeps popping up. Obviously, has made incredible progress over the last little while. My hope here today is to sort of get into a bunch of the things that maybe aren't super apparent if you're just sort of watching from afar. And I think most people probably are watching the space from afar, even to this day. But I think you have this sort of big announcement that I think came out this week. FWB has really been one of the communities that has driven this idea of seasons as being like the core organizational framework. So season 5, I believe, is being launched this week. I would love for you to maybe just to give us an insight into what's coming so we can get the alpha out of the way early.
Yeah. First off, thank you so much for having me. I've been like such a fan and supporter and just really appreciative of what you and the entire Seed Club team and then the ecosystem has sort of contributed thus far. Something like this is super needed, and it's been awesome I feel like we both kind of have ridden a lot of fun waves together over the last year, and so just to be on the trenches with you has been really enjoyable. So thanks for having me. Awesome to just kind of chat and hang with you here. Yeah, season 5. We started seasons as a way to just kind of create a little bit of like a tempo and a little bit of a cadence for the community. There's obviously parallels to other sort of cultural brands or institutions or movements like whatever fashion or TV shows or whatnot. But I think for us, it was just a really great way to sort of encapsulate an ethos over a period of time. For us, seasons are always 3 months, and to really set and underscore a theme to that season on what we as a DAO and we as a now of a network of over 100 or so contributors and a community of over 5,000 token holders want to sort of like subconsciously orient to. And for this season, the theme and the focus and the enjoyment has really been around beginning to create our own social spaces. And so what does that mean? I think over the last year, we've all watched DAOs bootstrap on top of amazing existing infrastructure, things like Discord, things like other little tools that through a myriad of what I call like bubblegum and scotch tape, we've like pieced together to make DAOs feasible and workable. But as we know, a lot of these tools are centralized, Web 2 built, and aren't, in my opinion, going to be what carries us fully into sort of Web 3. We're still in this like Web 2.5 phase. And so social spaces is this idea that as a community, beginning to really invest in our own tools. And I don't think like a Web 3 world where every DAO is building their own tools makes sense, but at least FWB starting to pick a couple core areas that we really want to carve out for ourselves. And so the big sort of focus of that, first and foremost, is social products and social spaces and social software. So starting to really think about one of the most demanded community products or needs that has been asked since inception has really been, how can I find and connect with other members? I see everyone in the Discord, but everyone's a pudgy penguin or a pseudonym, and I would like to actually chat and connect and better create friendships that have strong relevancy to me or strong cultural interest to me or whatnot. And how does that play in our larger ecosystem of like events and experiences? And so one component being, our first launch of a directory, which will really, I think, introduce an exciting social component and layer to the entire community. At the center of that directory will be a non-transferable NFT that sort of accrues value. That is your ID as a community member that accrues value based on your on-chain patterns and events you go to and people you connect with. Like on-chain friendship is something we've been thinking a lot about, and begin to make, bring a level of like fun and kind of like MySpace, Tumblr, forum era stuff of like creating these social identities online again, which I feel like right now our primary outlet is Twitter. And so 5 being around social spaces and creating our own spaces that are interoperable and connected with all these other different components and communities in the ecosystem. But I think really doubling down on like as a community, it's our belief that like the strength of FWB is really going to be defined by like how well we all individually know each other. This sort of dynamic of allowing for community members to branch off, do their thing, create things, but then to sort of come back together and share resources and knowledge through infrastructure and data and all of this that is community owned, that will allow us to eventually to stay cohesive and to really grow in sync, as opposed to something that just fragments in thousands of little pieces that never have sort of a return point. So season 5, baby, let's go.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And every time I talk to you, I have a million threads I want to pull on. But maybe you can contextualize season 5 by sort of sharing a little bit about some of the progress that was made over, say, 3 and 4. Like what were those focuses back then, and maybe some of the outcomes or learnings that came from them?
So I think for us, it was, I think touching on this last point around, we've kind of coined internally as like the relationship between convergence and divergence. The biggest learning over season 4 was watching just all the momentum that communities beget or scenes sort of beget, watching that sort of manifest in like incredibly amazing and surprising ways, but the connective tissue between them was starting to become thinner and thinner, if that makes sense. So examples of that would become, as we start to throw events, community members are like, I want to start to throw events. Or, as we start to launch products and create different software and tools that we begin to use, other community members are like, oh, I want to build a version of that. And the rate of proposals coming to the DAO has just skyrocketed, from people wanting to make an FWB cookbook to people creating, our own adaptogenic drink. Like it's like the types of opportunities are now way more, like I don't even review them anymore. There's a full proposal support team that just helps take proposals from like idea just to even be presentable. And those are in the dozens. And so as we started to watch this pattern emerge, it just became super clear that the answer is not to restrict that type of creativity, which in a normal corporate environment, it might be like, this isn't driving to our main OKR, so it's like squash that fun project or whatever, right? But instead to build systems that can embrace an FWB cookbook in whatever iteration that might look like, and have it just fit our level of qualifications and caliber and values that would make us as a community proud to say release it. And that's been a lot of the behind the scenes work that's been developed over season 4 that I think will start to manifest over 5, right? I kind of shared this like framework that like, if DAOs are sort of optimized for divergence, right? This idea of branching off or breaking out, or this act of separation, forking, right? If DAOs are optimized for divergence through labor, ideas, creativity, ideally even decision making, right? That's what we're all striving for, progressive decentralization. Then like some framework of convergence coming back together, what worked, what didn't work, right? We can't just keep making the same mistakes over and over. Some convergence, I think, is paramount for things like community-owned data, infrastructure, learnings, right? These ideas that like if you can have someone who goes out and does a project and they can then bring that data back to the nest to be like, hey, here's how this worked, and that data can then be shared to make better decisions. So the next person who wants to launch, say, a physical product can learn how to like, doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. I think that's where DAOs start to get really, really exciting, and that's what we hope takes shape over the course of season 5.
Yeah, I think that's this idea of managing momentum, or it's such a gift when you see people taking initiative and wanting to bring something into the world related to a DAO that you care so much about. And also there's like there's some fear that comes into that as well, right? Because there is a level of quality and sort of this interesting balance between them. And I think like the right critiques of DAOs right now are ones that are asking questions about how scalable and effective we can be as groups of people on the internet. And I think the answer you gave there is really like, is the answer. It's one of needing to really encourage that divergence and then learn faster and sort of internalize, or at least bring those structures in that helps people get better at doing that, not stop or refocus, maybe not hinder their ability to go do that. So, okay, I want to stay with season 5 here a little bit. And I think the idea of building social spaces, 2 things stood out in sort of like the outline you did there. One, this idea of like investing in our own tools is one that I think a lot about. And I think that probably the biggest shift that we're seeing in communities right now is the fact that communities with tokens and with their own bank accounts and balance sheets have resources to go build things, where in the past in Web 2, communities didn't really have even a business model generally to be able to have the resources to go build things. And so it forced most communities to build on top of other people's playgrounds. And I think one of the big shifts we're going to see here in Web3 is that we can go build our own playgrounds. But finding out or figuring out where and when to build those tools and when to use other tools, I think is actually a really big challenge and off the trodden path. I'm curious if you can share a little bit about how you guys were thinking about, when build, when buy.
Yeah. So I think it's important first and foremost that it depends on what stage you're in. And I think in the earliest stages, obviously, let's call it before community market fit or community protocol fit or whatever the terms are, before you feel like you've got something, piece together as many tools as you can, because you can get incredibly far pieced together. And it doesn't make sense to spend on developers and tech and creative to create infrastructure if no one's even going to use it, right? It's like whatever that whole minimum viable product kind of narrative. However, I think as a DAO and as a community starts to grow, the biggest paradigm shift is that communities as markets or communities as economies should begin to think about their own tools that correlate to the core mission and objectives of their organization. Does FWB need to go build a back-end payroll management software to handle contributor payments? No, there's amazing tools like Utopia or Parcel that will focus on that and execute on that. And as long as their roadmaps, I think, indicate a future of a decentralization, token governance, I think that to me is all great signs and of being able to play together in a deeper capacity, even just through constituency and voting. But I think based on if the mission and vision of your organization requires some technical product that enables it to unlock in a greater capacity, I think beginning to think about how the community in of itself can build and steward that into creation that it then owns is a very powerful mechanic. And so for us, the core of everything we do is social and community. That is ultimately community. As FWB, yes, you get all these amazing benefits and components that tack onto it, but everything we produce and create ideally has the end state of bringing you closer together to a community. And through proxy of helping cultural creators and maintainers enter their Web3 journey and harness Web3 tools, but it's all through community. It's all through social. The when is just understanding essentially how deeply it correlates to your mission, and then really, I guess, how big you want to go. But the biggest, I think, thing to just consider and keep in mind is that the Web 2 models of scale also don't really not matter, but the Web 2 grandeur of scale are not as relevant in these instances, because if you think about DAOs as more digital cooperatives, if you've got a great product that services 10,000 people or 20,000 people, and your market and your economy can sustain that, you don't need to go the Web 2 trad Facebook route of scaling to 1 billion users at the expense of your community, right? And so for us, it's is the directory Web 3 LinkedIn? No, it's not. It's a community tool that drives community value, that services community needs, that'll be a bespoke kind of boutique product that will grow and will be an amazing entry point. But I think the future of DAOs that excites a lot of us is that these are all parallel economies that can interoperate and connect with each other. And we don't need to create a market dominant leader that captures X% of the entire market, more so just drive a bunch of value to our core members that then drives value to the core FWB token. So I think that mechanic is super important when any communities are thinking about how do I think about what to build? It's just how you don't need to go that big. You just need to everyone's still blown away that FWB is only 5,000 community members, and we don't seek to become 1 billion members or users or whatever, or 1 million even. I think it's more thinking about how do we create tools that allow 25,000 or 50,000 people to work together that then impact and reach, say, 1 billion people through the culture, stories, and products that we sort of create.
So yeah, what's interesting to me is what I think there's an answer to that question that maybe I was half expecting, which is thinking through tools as a value driver to the community outside of just facilitating deeper connection, looking at building tools that maybe get exported to other DAOs, et cetera. And yet to hear your answer, I think it is one that really highlights the import. Like, I think there's so much value in that sort of focus and in building tools for your community. But in the back of the mind, like, is there an intention for these types of things to be exported to other places, or is your full focus like this is successful, if we just deliver value for our community?
Yeah, I think like a core part of FWB is also thinking about when open source and when can we share things and help other communities grow and navigate this space. And so there's tons of products that we've kind of created as byproducts of existence, things like Gatekeeper, right? Where like we built that to service the need of the community. We were throwing events. We needed a Web3 native way to verify who was holding the native ERC20 or ERC721 token to then grant admission into an event after trying to piecemeal different software together, aka using other tools. We created our own. We then used it and deployed it at 2 of our events. It went super, super well. And then a bunch of communities were asking us, and we just gave it all away for free. We were just like, yeah, like use it. I think it's as important for the ecosystem. And so I think there will be products that like we think can sort of take that like open source exit to community route, like Gatekeeper, and the value it drove to FWB was like we created an easy switch where anyone using the software could essentially toggle and allow anyone who holds FWB also into their experience. So it was a way where like during NFT NYC, during Basel, anyone who holds FWB could also get into like 5 other great parties or talks or events. And so I think we approach some products with this open source build rail mentality. And then we approach others with being a little more, let's say, like tight to the chest just in the beginning as we're like trying to figure out if it'll work or not. But I think the ultimate goal is to really like exit a lot of these products so people can build on top of them in a much more open source capacity.
Yeah, I think we put that to use for Squiggle DAO, which was awesome and
yeah,
worked really
exactly.
well. And interesting to sort of see like the way that you're thinking through how that product creates value for your members is less about driving revenue to you, but more about driving utility to your end users. Which gets me to think a little bit about this idea of sort of how you think about creating value within the FWB ecosystem. And I think your point around sort of this idea of things not needing to scale to the same size that we have in Web 2 being a really important one to get. And I think it's one that I personally struggle with a little bit to understand where that line really is, because there is still this sense of growth needed and of people wanting to become either a member or a holder or part of this adventure. And also, obviously, there's enough critique out there around the idea of how community scales and starts to break down at a certain point. But if we look at the core of some of these most impactful Web3 communities, truly the number of token holders here is not astronomical, and yet we're still seeing significant value. And the idea of like that staking mechanism of I'm going to hold tokens to be a part of something is actually very powerful, primitive. So I'm curious how I wonder if we can dive into that conversation a little bit. One, how are you thinking about growing value within the FWB context? And then 2, like, how far can we really push that idea that, well, maybe we only need 5,000 members to really create an extremely valuable organization in Web3?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's viewing that I think a lot of the infrastructural layer, if Web3 really extrapolates as great of heights as we hope it does over the next, 5-10 years, that a lot of that there will be major players in that space, but it'll be governed in a decentralized capacity with constituents and stakeholders around. But I think this idea of like, I've spent a lot of time thinking about like private social networks, and let's just extract private from the phrase exclusive and think more about like smaller and smaller niche groups of people that gather over specific things. A group of moms in Des Moines, Iowa that talk about knitting. Like that is, to an extent, that is a private social network. In a Facebook group right now, versions of that exist. I think that's where communities go, right? I think that there's a Dunbar number to community size in terms of at a certain point, it just becomes way too big. And I think allowing for these smaller and smaller groups that rely on local governance, local decision-making, the group of moms will be able to best decide the services and experiences they need for that group of 5,000 mothers, but then to create convergence, to create infrastructure that is shared between everyone, because not everyone needs to run their own servers or create their own info. So I think things like social, it becomes categorized, right? Things like social, things like events, things like experience, things like culture. I think local. People want small, shop local. I think that is a trait that people really, really gravitate towards as an organic human expression. But I think growing beyond that will rely heavily on like sort of more of the infrastructural stuff that I think needs to be streamlined, if that makes sense.
Totally. So do you sort of see FWB in 5 years, 10 years being one, like continuing to lean into this community and connection, but then 2, also being like providing some of that infrastructure layer for maybe like either sub communities emerging from FWB or broader? Like, is that the right way to think of like, Because I think there's so much energy and value in the community, but I hear you guys thinking about this at levels that I don't think are quite apparent to folks that don't have their heads deep in this space right now.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we do want to be providing playbooks and infrastructure, at least in the beginning, to sub communities that are emerging out of FWB, right? So we're deep right now in thinking about sub-DAO tokenomic structures, parent-child relationships of DAOs, how that relates on like a governance and IP on a token level. Before we start to like think about that for like the wider ecosystem, we're just not there yet. But like we definitely hope to like document, share, and distribute what our learnings are. But that's totally where we see FWB going, right? It's kind of cycles back to this convergence and divergence narrative that like hopefully in a year or 2 years, every major department within FWB will be its own sub-DAO, right? Editorial, product, marketing, whatever. They all connect with each other. Channels, you could think of like, we've used this analogy that FWB is a city. These channels as neighborhoods should have neighborhood government, should have neighborhood, decision making on the neighborhood level, right? So the example we're going through actively right now is our NFT general chat community, which has been like our most active, our sort of most boisterous, and really giving them local governance levers to be able to make decisions, deploy capital, focus on projects, run their own mini town halls to begin to create kind of their own infra with the goal that if it can kind of, let's say, prove a clear lane where they can all focus and play together, to set that up as a sub-DAO, allow it to figure out its own new tokenomics model that is attached to the FWB token, but like begin to let a smaller group of stakeholders feel a stronger sense of ownership over a local sort of neighborhood, right? It's this idea that like you're going to care if your street or your neighborhood or your corner is tidy versus like if you live in Williamsburg, you might not have as much of a say in how the Upper West Side is run. So I think just getting more into these like local communities and local decision making and then outsourcing those learnings so other communities, because at least from the conversations I've had with other DAOs of our size, that's the brush up that everyone's encountering.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think it's where the next level of growth, interest, and value creation is going to come from. And I think there's like, it's really messy right now, which I think is just such a great sign. Like there's a lot of experimentation happening in there, which sort of brings me to this idea of, I won't call it Web3 LinkedIn, but I kind of like that. Like, FWB reinventing Web3 LinkedIn kind of feels good to me. But the idea of sort of this, I guess, directory and then representing that sort of a membership in there as an NFT, I think there's some like really interesting conversation points around that. Can you maybe like expand on what that product is and the purpose it's going to solve? And I really want to get into thinking about reputation as maybe a bit of a bigger topic.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's totally where it stems from, right? We've been thinking a ton about what on-chain reputation and on-chain status and on-chain community really, really looks like, right? And first, the direct thing it's solving, right? Because that's an exercise we all go through a ton as a community is like, are we addressing an unmet need of the community? And so, kind of what I mentioned earlier, people would love to know who people are inside of FWB. It's just the fun of it. It's the equivalent if we're sitting in a restaurant, who's that person sitting over there on that table, right? And I think that like, because there is already that social dynamic and that watering hole aspect, a directory I think is just going to unlock friendships and connections and relevant introductions to like a whole other level, because so much of Web3 right now is we're all collectively in this making sense phase. We're all looking for amazing Solidity developers. We're all looking for great smart contract auditors. We're all looking for creative NFT curators. Like, I think there's so many people are always looking for people. And I think that if we can create something that is social and fun, but also serves that need in a Web3 native way, that'll just drive a ton of utility first and foremost. But then also everything we approach, we want it to be fun and we want it to be Web3 native. And so the big unlock for Mike Bodge and Dexter and the product team that have really been fully running, building, ideating, and concepting the directory has been at the heart of it is non-transferable NFT. So first and foremost, playing with non-transferable, I think, is fascinating, right? This idea that like there is no speculative value, there's no floor price, you cannot sell it, it is yours, it is your ID card. Two, it has this notion of pushing an NFT outside of the boundaries of NFTs equaling artwork or NFTs equaling PFPs or NFTs equaling, whatever, a square image, and moving into NFTs that render and evolve in real time. I think we've seen projects like that, right? I think Palmer wrote a quick post on kind of the role of SVGs and NFTs, or Brenner put out a really great sort of community garden NFT project that evolves based on your on-chain history. I think for us, it's thinking like that's where we're seeing that kind of the technology application use cases move from a social lens. And I think for us, it's really evolving. How can this NFT really represent your contributions as a community member, and contributions being measured as like proposals you voted on, NFTs that you collect and hold, events that you've gone to, but then also link to the bigger and broader ecosystem. Have you deployed an essay on Mirror? Have you minted a song on Catalog or Sound? Have you purchased or interacted with the marketplace like a Foundation or OpenSea? And beginning to like create all of this that lives in an ID that you own. It sits in your wallet. It'll populate on OpenSea. It'll have rarity traits in composition with the broader community. And so it'll allow for, and it'll store your metadata based on whatever if you want to docs, right? Alex Zhang inside of this NFT on the smart contract level, so that you can begin to interoperate with all these different other protocols or platforms that will want to call and request info from this NFT. And so we really see it as the center of this ecosystem, not only just within FWB, but it really being this passport that you like navigate throughout all these different social experiences that accrue reputation as you check into the FWB Art Basel, event, and then that sort of sticker then or stamp can then be customized on your card and really kind of gamify it and give it this like DIY feeling that I think we all miss from like the good old MySpace eras.
Yeah, this topic is super interesting to me because I think like my general take on approaches for reputation like on chain is that it's like trying to distinguish whether this is just like overpromising and under delivering potential or if there's just like maybe more how to apply these things. And I think actually this conversation is really interesting to me. So I think like capturing on-chain reputation is actually like not that useful, would be my default, in the ways that so much of the challenges are like, it's less interesting to me what sort of interactions you've had with smart contracts or you've done out there. It's far more, there's sort of like the what you've done, but there's also like the how you've done it. And the how you've done it, I think, is the truly one of the, and a very, very, very important part. Like we talk about that at C Club as vibes. It kind of creates this dynamic within the community. And so like, I think we've seen a number of startups that are sort of focused on this stuff and trying to represent reputation as NFTs. And it's sort of always missed a piece for me in that like, I just don't know how I or we would use that effectively to do something. But when you put in the lens of sort of like a brand and a community like FWB, it kind of shifts it for me a little bit, right? It's sort of like reputation within a game matters, but like my reputation within that game probably doesn't matter, on LinkedIn, for an example, right? And so there's like this playing field starts to matter quite a bit. And really what FWB is doing, and I hope what C Club does as well, is we're kind of creating this brand that having reputation and actually starts to matter. And there's context that kind of comes from maybe some more of the social interaction or curation that gets done on that level. Yeah, I'm curious, do you see this as like what is the utility you see being able to get from reputation right now? And maybe where do you hope that goes?
Yeah, I totally resonate with all the points you made. And I think right now, like interoperable reputation is going to be a very challenging thing to solve for. But at least speaking to like in-game dynamics, I think we can all agree that's been a totally validated model, right? People care about getting the punch cards on their card, right? People care about the skins you wear in a Fortnite game. They're like in-game status matters a ton. And at least within FWB, reputation matters a ton. And I think we can extrapolate and redefine what reputation means, because it means different things to different communities. But in FWB, it's clear just organically. You spend an hour in the Discord or you spend 5 minutes at a party, you can see what the community prioritizes. The community prioritizes cultural creators and cultural maintainers, right? And we love using this phrase recently of cultural maintainers, and the community prioritizes people who participate in upholding culture. And culture is broad. Art, technology, music, fashion, but FWB clearly has like a creative essence to it, and those are the individuals who are really elevated within our game. I didn't set that. I didn't define that. That is sort of how it's emerged, and so it's letting that be organically profiled in a way that is on-chain and earnable to help you find those people faster, right? I kind of equate it to like right now, how do you determine just someone you chat with or not? Right? In an incredibly noisy world where Twitter right now is the giant watering hole that is our industry, if someone DMs you, the first thing you do or reaches out, you search them on Twitter and you see how many mutual friends you got, and you see you just kind of do a quick scan, vibe of the profile picture, vibe of their bio, some of the last few things they've written about, and you then quickly sort of package what an off-chain or this scenario sort of on timeline profile reputation is that then determines that this person has a likelihood or propensity of liking them or connecting with them. And so I think if we can make that verifiable and meaningful within our community, first and foremost, like that's our core priority. I don't need FWB's directory to go make OpenSea's ecosystem work. It's about making our ecosystem really grow. Can that sort of profile and proliferate and create stronger models of who are upstanding citizens? I think of things like voting is awesome. If we can begin to show who votes on proposals and make voting sexy and like create like you get earlier access to event registrations based on like how much you vote, how frequently you vote, like that's that's an in-game reward mechanic that further like makes FWB a better city to live in, while also giving you reputation accrual that like you pay attention to what's happening.
I love that answer, and I totally agree. It got me thinking about a bunch of different things. I think one of like the big, when I was sort of reflecting on last year, one of the big insights I think we've had based on sort of some of the actions we've taken is that the right level to sort of manage rewards or design a reward mechanic at when you're starting off is sort of this meta level, right? Like the idea of having a governance token in FWB and being able to earn those or to sort of acquire those as part of your membership. And so I think like my takeaway from that was that like these sort of building micro economies and micro reward mechanisms that are financial were actually not super useful and were maybe detrimental to the building of a community. But when I hear your answer around the sort of gamification of your community, that's not the right way of framing it, but sort of creating game mechanics within some things like reputation or et cetera. It feels very different when you're getting rewards as access or you're getting rewards as, NFTs or badges or reputation marks that you can sort of start to layer in these things, incentivize the right actions that are going to create value on a micro, but not have those be tied to financial outcomes, but be them tied to things that are often more important or at least more intrinsically motivated. So I think like for people listening to this call right now, this little box of conversation we just had around reputation, I think is, at least for me, probably the most valuable insight that I pulled from this conversation and sort of has reshaped how I'm thinking a little bit about where we can be a lot more prescriptive in trying to drive outcomes that are good for our community, absent of financial reward.
Exactly. I love that. And I think, I think the over gamification of communities and reputation can be disastrous and icky. And I don't think it doesn't work for everyone. And I think for us, it's really, how do we lead from a place of fun? How do we lead from a place of like the soft intangibles that come with seeing a really tattered membership card indicates more that you used it a ton than it actually equates to the benefits, the perks of like the free, whatever, 10th coffee you received from going to this local coffee shop. And so it's like, it's less about the like specifics and the explicits. It's more about like the feeling of patronage, the feeling of going deeper down the rabbit hole and building an affinity towards something. And ultimately, I think for us, it correlates not to financial perks. It won't be like, oh, the more you do this, the more money you earn, or the more tokens you earn. It'll be really like having a greater say on how things are governed and done. Because it's ideally, if you've played the game long enough, you'll have the best ideas on how to improve it.
I love the tattered card reference. I think that's a great example of trying to highlight some of the nuance that can be missed, I think, in digital representations of reputation, but ultimately don't need to be. Interesting. All right. So I want to shift gears here a little bit because I think there's infinite number of these sort of conversations we can lean into the future on, sort of think of what's being built and what we're seeing emerging. But, there's a lot of people listening to this podcast that I think would be very interested in understanding just a little bit more of like the inner workings of what you guys have been building over the last little while. You use the term the mayor of FWB and the aspiring Jane Jacobs of DAOs. I'm curious if you can unpack that title decision a little bit and then even just sort of like the one-liner that you're using as your bio.
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's funny. I did it. I think I was like late at night. I just was like, I need a new bio, and it really stuck to the urbanists and the urban theory nerds out there. Jane Jacobs is a hero amongst us all. Yeah. So mayor, I think the whole DAO space, the whole Web3 space, it needs a little uplift or a reinvention on like how we syntax and language, because it's clear we just don't have the right things to label things. And I was frustrated by that in the beginning, because language and titles are important, whether you know it or not, right? If everyone is a leader of a project, how do you decide who actually to go to for what sort of things, right? And so I think for this, it was clear that like some sort of position of operational or strategic leadership was needed. Effectively, when I joined, I was the first contributor that was sort of paid to do this. I entered a team of 7 other sort of incredible co-founders who had really founded the project. But operationally, my role was that of a CEO. It was to come in, to build a team, to figure out a roadmap, not obviously singularly, but to collaborate with the team and directly with the community, but to be the first full-time person to really like obsess over thinking about like what could this become. And I think we met like a couple of weeks after that. But at the same time, I think a CEO, by definition, a chief executive officer, whose fiduciary responsibility is to drive value to shareholders and to owners and to make executive, singular, monolithic decisions, it felt so off to me. It was not inherent to what FWB wanted to become, or what I thought the space in the community sort of needed at the time. And I've always thought, I've used this a lot, where like building community or building DAOs is more gardening than it is architecture, where you don't need an architect, you need like a gardener. You need someone who's just like kind of paying attention to what's happening and kind of putting sort of parameters around things and giving them the attention it needs to sort of thrive and to grow. And so over time, we started to become as a community really into this urban relational narrative or branding, right? It came from a handful of different community members. And once that really landed with the community, where for the first time it felt like, wow, FWB is a city. These channels are neighborhoods. The governance is our local, sort of government. It started to become really exciting of like, oh, well, then clearly my role is as a mayor. I'm an official that is here for a period of time. We haven't yet set that, but I totally plan on like once we as a team feel like sort of things are in a sustainable stage to run an election for the next mayor to come in and take my role, assume my pay, everything, then I can move into a different role within the DAO. Felt incredibly exciting and inspiring to me and the wider team, and to begin to build in concepts of cycles and terms. And I think it's still too early because it would be way too turbulent. But I think once FWB reaches a maturity that I think we can all get it toward as a community, allowing for someone else who may have a different set of skills and a different vision for FWB that the community votes in and is bought in behind would just be incredibly exciting, I think, to the future of how online communities and communities in general are run. Because communities aren't companies. They're fundamentally different. And so the Jane Jacobs of the aspiring Jane, I would never call myself Jane Jacobs of DAOs, only hope to aspire, is just a sort of a prolific theorist and writer and a woman who really advocated for very specific styles of ways cities could develop, very emergent strategies, very aligned with Christopher Alexander, who wrote Pattern Language and Timeless Way of Building and the Oregon Experiment, as just ways of building cities that are not top down, but are very sort of parameter driven, but ground up. And it felt incredibly resonant as a format to lead FWB along this sort of convergent and divergent narrative. So yeah, that sort of like little slogan I try to apply to like decision making and distribution of projects within Friends with Benefits.
So I think that's one of the, watching from afar and seeing the growth that's happened over the last, say, 6 months, even in what has been a very massive scaling effort as far as bringing people in, creating pathways for them to create value within FWB. And I've seen this in like small little pockets as I interact with maybe the event squad a little bit, and I sort of see, what you're working on. I think there's like this general belief out there that a lot more attention is being placed on sort of DAO onboarding and thinking about making it easy for contributors to come in and to participate. And I think a piece that's often missed if you aren't actually sort of in the trenches building is realizing that most of the friction maybe isn't around creating context or creating pathways, but it's actually in finding ways for people to actually create value. Like, how do you actually, as an organization, scale the path, like the actual ways for people to participate, create meaningful value without it kind of being, well, wasted effort, crazy, etc. And I think there's a bunch of different approaches to this. But I'm curious, like, what has your approach been to scaling contributors within FWB?
A really amazing breakthrough we had as a team was, and I think something that actually is a little bit counter to at least the overarching narrative of contributor onboarding that I continue to hear and be sort of approached by, is right now DAOs are only designed for really one style of contributor, which is the contributor who has time and labor to contribute and sort of throw themselves into a role and to like sort of figure it out, right? So that sort of early stage component. And in fact, I think DAOs should often be thinking a lot about what are other ways, how do we redefine what it means to be a contributor, not just joining a team and contributing with labor, but how do we actually contribute through different mechanisms like intellectual capital or advice or distribution or different formats that maybe aren't as time bound, right? Like in other words, if you're an artist and you are dedicated full time to your craft, or you're a startup founder and you are running your own company and you are slammed 40 hours a week, what does the contributor on-ramping look like for that person who doesn't have time to raise their hand and go through right now the super clunky onboarding, figure it out, join all the team calls, etc. So we have by no means solved that, but like I think that is a massive area to start to think about, because as we push forward on like town halls and we start, a lot of other DAOs are now doing town halls, it's like, is that really the best format for everyone to be able to follow along on how a DAO operates and runs and where you can contribute? Can there be more fractionalized opportunities that aren't as, say, like lowbrow as like, throw this emoji in your Twitter bio and retweet this and you get a token, but really more about like, how do we help with sort of like laser focused initiatives that don't require as much labor or time, but can just require expertise and advice. And so I think how FWB has scaled has been really thinking about both of those routes. We have full-time contributors who this is their jam. They love it. They're in it. We're in it together. But 80% of FWB's contributors all have full-time practices or jobs or their own thing. And I think that that's actually super important because I think it allows for us to scale to eventually, say, 500 to 1,000 contributors that slide in and out based on life, which I think is super important, but to generate value and compensation through both their existing token holdings as well as on-chain upside. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of like how to empower contributors through on-chain upside. And a good example could be how we're starting to think about our curatorial team. FWB's NFT practice has been evolving over the last 4 months. We've done a handful of different curated collections and drops. We auctioned Nadia from Pussy Riot's Vial of Blood NFT project. We've done Matthew Ball's first metaverse essay. And we started to think a lot about like, okay, a traditional on-ramping process would be like, oh, how do you hire a project manager or an operations person to just find those types of opportunities and execute against those opportunities and pay them a salary in tokens? But as we started to like really go down some of those motions, we started to realize, wait, information and access is totally asymmetric. If you were able to like get the craziest alpha on an NFT drop, or an artist or a massive contemporary artist or a filmmaker who was ready to do their first NFT project, you don't need a full-time person bringing you that opportunity. You need someone who is incentivized and motivated, either financially or socially, to bring and curate that project, empower them with an on-chain split through participating in the life cycle of that project, but allow for them to be as flexible and dynamic as the market or as their individual bandwidth allows them to be. And so how we've shifted our curatorial contributing track is now we're engaging some of the best curators in contemporary art, in culture, in Web3 to curate for FWB, allow them to participate on the on-chain level of a split, so future upside of a project that they're able to bring in and nurture and develop, and then building a team of operational people that then help them execute that project according to our standards. So divergence in terms of curatorial and taste and selection, but then like convergence in terms of operational standardization and like best practices. And so we're now starting to hire, and that's been a really fun process because now we're able to recruit and partner with contributors that couldn't afford to just, join a DAO full time, but can give us 5 to 10 hours a week, even less, of reviewing things, giving feedback on things, picking a micro project over the course of a season, and then also bringing opportunities into the fold.
Yeah, I think this is like a great example of the yes and, right? Where we need to have folks that are, there's an immense value in somebody taking a leadership role and putting sort of full attention towards something and taking that level of responsibility. And that needs to be there, and it's foundational to these organizations. And most likely there's just so much genius in our broader communities that we probably need to build better pathways into allowing that to sort of be put to use. And I think like the conversation on onboarding or the challenges on onboarding in that specific vein of like there's specific talent that needs to be matched with specific opportunities, and it becomes this like maybe more matchmaking rather than educational or knowledge tree building or scientific discovery unlocking, I think feels right to me. Because we talk a lot about the difference between sort of like monogamish work and monogamous work, and like how challenging it can be to kind of to see so many contributors pulled across dozens of different DAOs or even 6 or 5. I mean, it's very hard to be meaningfully engaged in that. But I think the way that it does work is to say, well, I have actually developed this specific skill that I can go apply in specific ways across multiple different communities. To me, that feels like it's very aligned. Whereas if you're trying to say, well, I want to be in an operational role in a DAO, and you're working for 2 or 3 DAOs, then it's going to be a tough thing to actually do well.
Totally agreed.
All right. I have a big question that's really relevant to us at C Club right now. In so many ways, I think this conversation has shown just the thoughtfulness and the leadership that you and the broader FWB community has sort of stepped into in the space at large. And I think a big inflection point over the last year was the Treasury diversification round that you guys did that really brought some really great backers on board. And I think surprised a lot of people as far as like the perception of value in this space. I know you guys spent a lot of time thinking about how to do that well, engaging in that process. I'm wondering if you sort of look back on that, if there's any lessons that you can share with us as far as what worked well and turned out the way you thought it would. Is there anything that we might do differently as we sort of have a number of our communities experiencing or approaching a similar inflection point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually, it's kind of been in the back of my mind here and there of just thinking about like, wow, okay, now that the dust is settled, and we kind of knew there'd be like a pop, right, a moment of fervor, but if things would settle and it would be build time. I still think it was a really, really strategic and great decision on behalf of the community. I think the thinking that's carried through and throughout has always been this idea that like being able to collaborate with people from a strategic and a capital perspective who think over a multi 5, 10 year horizon is incredibly beneficial to this space, just given how fast it moves. And I think directly, let's say the other option, which would be fundraising directly from the community, I think introduces some really challenging perspectives, right? Asking a bunch of community members to fork over whatever 10, 20, 30K is not insignificant. And then to be able to like now have 300, 400 people who are like deeply accountable and could, I think, add a lot of anxiety to the team versus people who, based on wherever things in the larger market might go. I still feel like having a group of sort of in the trenches financiers and collaborators has allowed people to continue to think over a long period of time. And the value they brought has actually frankly surprised me. It's been awesome. I always have been taught like, oh, VCs are only as good as you engage them. But like a lot of folks have been incredibly proactive, giving resources, thinking about things that are really, really challenging, like legal and organizational structure and all that sort of things. In terms of what I would have done differently or what I would have sort of advocated to do differently to the community, I think the timing is interesting. I think I would sort of advise other projects to really think about when it makes sense to do something like that. Perhaps, let's say, removing a bunch of other variables, like who knows where the market goes in the next 3, 6, 9 months. But like, let's just presume all that's stable. Perhaps would have done the Treasury diversification or pushed for it to be done later, just to have allowed more like infrastructural things to be built. We're still building just basic onboarding tools. And so to have been able to like capture, say, a lot of that like interest into like really into cultural assets or into projects or like if, for instance, if the amount of NFT project we were getting hit up with 4 months ago, 5 months ago, when there wasn't even a team and I was me and like one other person was taking them all, I'm sure lots of things slipped through the cracks. To have that come now or where our team's at would have been really, really amazing. And just strictly talking from like, say, a value perspective, but it's not super like fruitful or healthy to think in that lens of timing because who knows. And so far it's been really strong where it's allowed us to hire great people. I mean, almost all the spend has gone towards hiring and just bringing on contributors and people who are working for pretty much little to no compensation or just tokens, now being able to be like, great, I quit my trad job and now I'm doing this full time and buckle up.
Yeah, I love that answer. I think this is a game of timing in so many ways. And the phrase I use all the time is playing the ball where it lies. You got to sort of deal with it where you're at. So yeah, it's been phenomenal to sort of see the progress you guys have made. I think you're right. We're entering a time to build, which is really quite awesome. It's been an intense past year. I don't know where the market goes for the next little while. I think the most empowering thing for most of the builders that I'm talking to is that it really doesn't matter where it goes. I think we're in a really great position right now to go build these communities. And yeah, it's just been, very impressive to see the team that's come together around FWB. I'm always incredibly appreciative of the support that you have given us over at C Club and look forward to continue that collaboration as we grow and get to sort of tap into your genius and the genius of your team. So we're up on the hour here, Alex. Really appreciate you spending the time with us here today. Now, this comes out in a couple days. Where should we be directing people's attention? Shill us.
Yeah, you can find out all about our happenings on fwb.help. I mean, it's all there. And if you want to get involved, there's a great how to get involved section there. And we just put out season 5 last week, and that's on our website and on our community page. So yeah, man, so always so nice to hang out with you, Jeff. I appreciate you.
Ditto, my friend.